Welcome to A Guide to Every Deck in EDH. Today we're looking at Auntie Blyte Bad Influence. So right off the bat, I'm going to say this is not a CDH power level deck, although I think you can make it fairly powerful. So what is Auntie Blyte doing? Well, Auntie Blyte is a 3 mana, mono red 2/2 flyer, and it says whenever a source you control deals damage to you, put that many +1/+1 counters on Auntie Blyte Bad Influence. And it has 1 red tap, remove X+1 counters from it. It deals X damage to any target. So right away, you can see that the trigger is not reined in by any sort of restriction. So if we can find a way to deal a ton of damage to ourselves really fast, we can make Auntie Blyte a 21 power creature or higher to get the commander damage in to kill someone in one shot, or find a way to split the damage up from it to all of our opponents simultaneously and kill them all. So that is primarily what we're going to do. Also, it can also remove the counters from itself to deal damage to them if we, for whatever reason, can't attack our opponent. So what are we going to do? So first of all, we are mono red, so we are pretty restricted in what we can do. So we've got our card draw. So we've got Birgie's Backside in the Harnfell Horn of Bounty. We've got Jeska's Will, which will double as fast mana. We've got the One Ring. We've got Throne of Eldraine, which doubles as mana ramp. We've got War Room, Wheel of Fortune, and Wheel of Misfortune. Particularly Wheel of Misfortune is a big, has a lot of benefit in this deck over other decks, because since it's damaging us, we can bid however much we want and then get Auntie Blyte up to a huge power level off of the wheel. Then we've got our combo pieces. So All Will Be One, whenever you put 1 or more counters on a permanent or player, All Will Be One deals that much damage to target opponent, creature an opponent controls, or planeswalker an opponent controls. Of course, Auntie Blyte is having +1 counters put on it, which means that whenever we put a +1 counter on it, the All Will Be One will trigger. It unfortunately only targets one opponent at a time, so we can't simultaneously kill everybody, but we can rack up this damage really fast. It also means that if we have any way of damaging ourselves in the deck, that Auntie Blyte can ping off creatures, since its ability targets anything, although we can only do it one at a time, but we can use the ability of All Will Be One to target whatever we want. So if we have a way to damage, we go damage, Auntie Blyte gets a counter, trigger All Will Be One, ping off their creatures. So ping off stacks creatures, ping off combo creatures, etc. And then of course, All Will Be One combos with Quest for Pure Flame, so we may as well have that in the deck as well. Whenever a source you control deals damage to an opponent, you may put a quest counter on it, remove 4 counters from it, and sack it. If any source you control would deal damage to a creature or player this turn, it deals double that damage to that creature or player instead. So All Will Be One combo. This was briefly around in Modern, before ultimately proving not to be that good, but it can be here in EDH anyway. As long as we have both of these in play, any source of damage to our opponent will start a chain reaction, triggering them both, killing everybody. And then we do need ways to protect ourselves, so we do have counter spells, Pyroblast, Red Blast, Tybalt's Trickery. Pretty restricted in what we can do in mono red. We could also be playing Burnout, and there's like a few other red spells that maybe can apply, but these are going to be our primary counter spells in red. Then of course, we've got fast mana. In this deck, we just want to get Auntie Blyte out as fast as possible and get combos online to kill our opponents as fast as possible, so we're going to want a lot of fast mana. Desperate Ritual, Pyretic Ritual, Rite of Flame, Lotus Petal, Jeweled Lotus, Jeska's Will, Seething Song, Simian Spirit Guide, Blank Goblin, and Runaway Steamkin, which is not exactly fast mana in the same way that all of these ones are. It's more like a Dockside Extortionist type effect. It does require that it's in play, plus we play a bunch of other red spells, but it can potentially apply. Also, it gets +1 counters, so it does somehow kind of go off with All Will Be One, although it obviously doesn't like straight up combo with it, but it is relevant to point out that interaction. Then we do want Auntie Blyte to get haste. We want to play Auntie Blyte and then immediately power it up and attack our opponent to death. So we do want to get haste if possible. This is not the full extent of haste cards that we could grab. We could play other haste cards, but it's also important that we protect Auntie Blyte. We don't want to take, 20 or I guess 19 damage off of our damage sources to get Auntie Blyte up to 21 power only for our opponent to then kill it. So we do want to give it Shroud/Hexproof. And these giving haste as well makes them ideally suited for this deck. Then in our lands, this is pretty straightforward. We are playing a fair number of non-basic lands that could just be mountains, but this is going to be relevant for another reason that'll come up later. Some lands to point out in particular are any land that does damage to us, so Barbarian Ring, City of Brass, and that's pretty much it for that. Tarnished Citadel also does 3 damage to us. Witch's Clinic gives our commander lifelink, so if we want to recoup a bunch of the life that we're spending, we can just Witch's Clinic our Auntie Blyte once it's a huge power level. Plaza of Heroes also, if we have enough mana around, can act as protection, although I wouldn't count on it since it does cost tapping itself plus another 3, and you have to exile it, so it's only a one-off. And then just a bunch of other cards. Ancient Tomb also does damage to us, so that's also relevant. So although we can damage ourselves in small increments with these lands, we're primarily going to want to do it in large bursts to get Auntie Blyte up to a huge power level, but this is, again, relevant to point out the interaction. And then in cards that protect us, not only do we have Cavern, Plaza, and the Boots, but Deflecting Swat, of course, and Defense Grid, so our opponents can't counter or remove our guy during our turn. Although can't is not exactly correct. Taxing by 3 isn't can't, but it is can't in many situations. Then, of course, a bunch of ramp. So, ton of Mana Rocks, Dockside, Ruby Medallion to reduce the cost of our red spells, Ragavan, and then we've got the keys, so Voltaic Key, Manifold Key, and Sonic Screwdriver. These are relevant to untap cards like Mana Vault, Grim Monolith, and Throne of Eldraine to add more mana than it's costing to untap. And these also combine with the One Ring to draw us even more cards. A little bit of removal. Our Blasts double as removal for blue spells. Our Shatter Skull Smashing doubles as removal in some cases, although again, you can't count on it. And Barbarian Ring can also double as a shock sometimes. It's also relevant to point out that for Auntie Blyte, only damage matters. Life loss does not matter. So cards like Shatter Skull Smashing that have life payment as a cost do not power up Auntie Blyte. And then here is the list of self-damaging effects that we have. So these cards in here might do other things, but they're primarily in here to be self-damaging effects. So what are they? Well, we've got Acidic Soil, 3 mana sorcery. It deals 1 damage to each player for each land they control. So obviously it's not going to be a huge amount, and it will get better as the game goes along and is worse early in the game. But it is kind of relevant in that it also damages all of our opponents. Again, not that much, but somewhat. This is probably one of the most cuttable cards in the deck, though, because it's not powering up Auntie Blyte that much, and it's not dealing that much damage to our opponents. In a similar vein, we've got Price of Progress. This is 2 damage to each player for each non-basic they control, and this is primarily the reason why we want to play non-basic lands as opposed to just mountains, because it means Price of Progress will deal us more damage, thus powering up Auntie Blyte more. And we've got Ancient Runes, 3 mana enchantment. During each player's upkeep, it deals 1 damage to that player for each artifact they control. So this applies to both us and our opponents again. Anytime that we have a way to deal a ton of damage to ourselves, but also a bunch of damage to our opponents, is going to be highly valuable. We've got Ankh of Mishra, 2 mana artifact. Whenever a land enters the battlefield, it deals 2 damage to the land's controller. Burning Earth, 4 mana enchantment. Whenever a player taps a non-basic land for mana, Burning Earth deals 1 damage to them. Cemetery Gatekeeper, 2 mana, 2/1 first strike. When it enters the battlefield, you exile a card from a graveyard, and whenever any player plays a land or casts a spell, if it shares a card type with the exiled card, Cemetery Gatekeeper deals 2 damage to that player. So if you exile a land, whenever a player plays a land, it deals 2 to them. If you exile a non-land, whenever a player plays a spell that has the same type as that spell that you exiled, it deals 2 damage to them. So, again, same vein, you can exile one of your own cards and then deal damage to yourself when you play cards that share the same type, or a land if you exile the land, and it will also damage opponents in the same way. Then we've got Earthquake. X and red, deal X damage to each creature without flying in each player. So it is a sweeper that is also a way of damaging yourself. And notably, Auntie Blyte has flying, so this doesn't damage Auntie Blyte. We've got Eidolon of the Great Revel. Whenever a player casts a spell with mana value 3 or less, it deals 2 damage to that player. And Pyrostatic Pillar, which is just an enchantment that does the same thing. These are kind of stacks pieces in a sense because they do harm Storm style decks and any deck that relies on a combo where you cast the same thing over and over. But in those combo cases, a lot of time your opponent can kill you before having to actually go infinite. So it doesn't straight up stop them, but it is a way to tax our opponents via life while also giving us the opportunity to damage ourselves a whole bunch to trigger Auntie Blyte. Then we got Flame Break, triple red. Deal 3 damage to each creature without flying in each player. Creatures dealt damage this way can't be regenerated this turn. So it's a sweeper for smaller creatures that doesn't hit Auntie Blyte, and it also hits everybody. So it will power up Auntie Blyte by 3. Then one of our biggest self-damage dealers, Heartless Hidetsugu. Tap it, deal damage to each player equal to half their life total rounded down. So again, this is half your life rounded down, which depending on how much life you're at when you use this, is going to be somewhere around 20 to potentially less if you've damaged yourself a whole bunch, but can be as much as 20 life, which will immediately power up Auntie Blyte enough to one-shot players. It will also damage your opponents in a huge amount, which can then add to all of these other various damaging effects that you're playing. Mana Barbs, similar to Burning Earth, whenever a player taps a land for mana, it deals 1 damage to them. In this case, it's any land, not just non-basics. Pyrohemia. At the beginning of the end step, if no creatures on the battlefield, sacrifice it, and it has red, deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. So, this is color-shifted Pestilence, and notably, even though it does damage Auntie Blyte, it also damages you, so it will make Auntie Blyte get powered up every time you use it, so you'll never actually be dealing more damage to Auntie Blyte than it's powering up by, in which case, it basically reads however much red mana you have, you can power up Auntie Blyte by that much, and also continuously sweep the board. Since Auntie Blyte will never die with this in play, it also means that you can keep using this to clear the entire board of every other creature while keeping Auntie Blyte around. Then we got Roiling Vortex, which arguably does a better anti-storm job than Eidolon or Pyrostatic Pillar because it's 5 damage every time a player casts a spell without paying for it. This also applies to us if we cast our own spells like Chrome Mox, Mox Diamond, etc. It's also a Sulfuric Vortex, and then it's dealing 1 damage to every player, 1 damage to every player on their upkeep. And it also can sometimes be relevant to shut off our opponents being able to gain life with the 3rd ability. Then we've got Spell Shock. Whenever any player casts a spell, deal 2 damage to them. This is another one that's going to rack up really fast. And then finally, Volcano Hellion. So Volcano Hellion is kind of similar to Heartless Hidetsugu. It is 4 mana, 6/5. It has Echo X, where X is your life total. So you're never paying for this, first of all. Secondly, when it enters the battlefield, it deals an amount of damage of your choice to you and target creature. The damage can't be prevented. So basically, it comes in, you pick a really, really high number, you kill the most problematic creature on the opponent's side of the battlefield, take a ton of damage, and power up Auntie Blyte into lethal immediately. So these self-damagers range in how much and how valuable they are. The ones that can deal a ton to you right away, or which rack up stuff really fast, like Spell Shock, Hidetsugu, Hellion, and Pyrohemia, are more valuable. The ones that are only one-off effects, like Flame Break, Acidic Soil, Price of Progress, these ones are less valuable. But you do want a certain amount of self-damaging effects, particularly ones that allow Auntie Blyte to immediately power up to maximum. It does kind of suck that there's no card that can just be activated over and over and over for life totals. So for example, there's like Phyrexian mana activation creatures, but all of those are life payments rather than self-damage. So none of those work. I was really looking around to see if there was any artifacts or creatures that did anything like that, but there unfortunately are not. So this is the best we're gonna do. Again, all of these cards range in how valuable they are. With more experience with the deck, you might cut some of them. So if you were gonna cut any of these, the ones that I would think are the least valuable are the ones that are both one-off effects, so they don't continue to apply, and the ones that deal the least amount of damage. So I would say probably Acidic Soil, Flame Break, potentially Eidolon and Pyrostatic Pillar, Cemetery Gatekeeper, and then maybe Mana Barbs and Burning Earth, because they're just like, they do damage to a fair amount, but not like a lot. Although this will add up, as will Spell Shock. Price of Progress, I think, does enough damage that it's worth keeping around as well. Like, a lot of these are also going to depend on your metagame, right? So, like, if your opponents are playing a bunch of small, cheap creatures, especially if they have stacks creatures or combo creatures, then cards like Pyrohemia and Flame Break are going to be, and Earthquake are going to be more valuable. But if they're more on spell-based decks or stack-based combos, then they're going to be less valuable. So adjust these as you see fit for your local play group or metagame. Then we've got cards that are stacks pieces. So we're in mono red, so obviously we can play Blood Moon and Magus of the Moon. Trinisphere is also valuable in that we're not really playing like a whole bunch of spells all at once really fast, other than fast mana to get here. So this, 1, stops our opponents from storming out, and 2, kind of acts as a defense grid type card where it can make it more difficult for opponents to interact with us. Then we've got sweepers. So obviously, as mentioned already, we've got Earthquake and Flame Break, but then importantly, there's Chandra's Ignition. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to each other creature and each opponent. So depending on how big Auntie Blyte gets, this can be a one-shot kill to kill our opponents, especially if we got it there via a card like Heartless Hidetsugu and our opponents are already at halved life totals, then this will just straight up kill them. It will also just straight up kill every single creature they have on the field. Do note though that this targets, so if they remove Auntie Blyte in response, it does nothing. then a little bit of tutoring, Imperial Recruiter and Urza's Saga, and then some other artifacts that I wanted to play for other reasons. So Commander's Plate protects Auntie Blyte from all non-red spells. And then Basilisk Collar and Shadow Spear are just more ways of giving it lifelink so we can recoup the amount of damage that we're dealing ourselves. Again, we're dealing a ton of damage to ourselves, so this is a way of getting it back. Then some cards that I didn't have a firm category to put them in. So Ketis, whenever a commander you control deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to each other opponent. So again, once we get Auntie Blyte up to a really high power level, if we have this in play, we can triple the amount of damage by spreading it around to all of our opponents, potentially one-shotting them. Lizard Blades gives double strike. That's relevant to some degree. Neheb is going to combine with all of the damage effects that we're dealing. So at the beginning of your post-combat main phase, add red for each 1 life your opponents have lost this turn. So this combines with both Auntie Blyte herself and any other effect that we have in the deck that's dealing a bunch of damage, Earthquake, all of the damage dealers, etc., to produce an absolutely ton of red mana. But it's not exactly a ramp card because it's a one-off effect that only applies if we damaged our opponent. And it's not really a fast mana card either because it itself already costs 5. So it's not exactly in either of those categories, but it's just a really big mana spell. And then Soul Film Mayhem Dominus, 4 mana 5/4. If a source you control would deal non-combat damage to an opponent or a permanent an opponent controls, it deals double that damage to that player or permanent instead. So it combines with all of the half your life damage dealers like Hidetsugu, or just ups the damage a lot on cards like Price of Progress, dealing absolutely tons of damage to them. And then in a similar vein, we've got Furnace of Wrath. If a source would deal damage to a creature or player, it deals double that damage to that creature or player instead. There are other Furnace of Wrath type cards, including Uncivil Unrest. Non-token creatures you control have Riot. They enter the battlefield with your choice of a +1 counter or haste. And if a creature you control with a +1 counter on it would deal damage to a permanent or player, deals double that damage. You could play more Furnace of Wrath type effects. I think all of the other ones are worse, mostly because they're just more expensive than either of these. But if you wanted to, you could. And then lastly, Price of Glory. Whenever a player taps a land for mana during another player's turn, destroy that land. So it's kind of a protection spell in that it highly disincentivizes our opponents from countering our stuff or casting any other disruptive piece like Swords to Plowshares or whatever during our own turn. But it doesn't actually stop them from doing it, so it's not exactly a protection spell, but it's kind of in that same vein. So that is the Auntie Blyte deck. So again, just to recap, use self-damage dealing sources to damage ourselves to trigger Auntie Blyte. To get Auntie Blyte usually up to 21 power so we can one-shot opponents, or just stack up a bunch of damage effects. We can also win via some stacks pieces like Blood Moon or Magus of the Moon, although it is very much worth noting with this deck that it is very risky and sort of glass cannon-y. Although we don't technically need Auntie Blyte to win the game, it's much harder to do so without her. And a lot of these cards also can backfire on us, so because we're doing a ton of damage to ourselves, I mean, that's obviously a problem. It's kind of the Death Shadow effect, where it puts us in a more vulnerable position to dying from opposing creature combat or just our own self-damaging effects. Like, we can only take so much self-damage before we just lose the game. Cards like Mana Barbs continue to tax our life total, even after the point that we wanted to continue to use it, and we have no way of getting rid of it. So we can only take so much damage before these become detrimental to the point where we're going to lose the game. So you do have to carefully craft your plan around using these cards. But anyway, that is the Auntie Blyte Bad Influence EDH deck.